April 26, 1986. In the middle of the night, silence shattered inside reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. A routine safety test had spiraled out of control. Then, disaster. 2 massive explosions ripped the reactor apart, blasting its 1,000-ton lid skyward and showering the night with radioactive fire. Flames lit the horizon as graphite from the core burned like embers from a furnace. Above it all, an invisible plume of radiation drifted silently across Ukraine. For the people of Pripyat, life would never be the same. For the world, it was the dawn of the worst catastrophe in history. The Chernobyl plant, just 10 miles south of Pripyat, was once a pride of Soviet engineering. On April 25, 1986, operators prepared for a safety test to simulate a power outage and determine whether backup generators could keep the reactor's cooling pumps running until emergency systems engaged. But the test was riddled with danger. To carry it out, operators were required to disable critical safety mechanisms that would have automatically shut the reactor down during testing. A series of delays caused the reactor's power to drop far below safe operating levels, leaving it unstable. In an effort to recover, operators withdrew most of the control rods to raise power again. The RBMK reactor design was notoriously dangerous at low power because steam bubbles actually increased reactivity. This unstable state primed the reactor for disaster. The point of no return came at 1:23 a.m. on April 26th. When operators pressed the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button, they expected the control rods to halt the chain reaction. But here lay a fatal design flaw. The RBMK's control rods were tipped with graphite. As they entered the core, the graphite displaced coolant and momentarily increased reactivity instead of reducing it. In that instant, the reactor's unstable condition turned deadly. The shutdown attempt triggered a massive surge, and the explosion was inevitable. Within moments, the reactor's energy output skyrocketed beyond its design limit. The design output limit was 3,200 megawatts thermal. The peak during testing was estimated up to 30,000 megawatts thermal. The first explosion, a steam blast, hurled the 1,000-ton biological shield from its place, ripping open the reactor core. A second, more powerful explosion followed, tearing apart the roof and upper walls of the building. Fires erupted across the site, graphite burned fiercely, and the reactor lay exposed to the open air, spewing radioactive material into the night sky. The first to confront the destruction were the firefighters of Pripyat. They believed they were fighting an electrical blaze. With no protective suits or knowledge of the invisible danger, they climbed onto the burning roofs, kicking flaming graphite aside with their boots, even lifting it with their bare hands. What they didn't know was that the graphite was part of the reactor core, still burning with lethal radiation. Within hours, firefighters began collapsing from acute radiation syndrome. Some vomited, others developed blisters and burns. Although some survived with lasting health effects, many would die within weeks. Meanwhile, the city of Pripyat carried on almost as normal. Families watched the distant glow of the fire from their balconies. Children played outside the next morning beneath a sky filled with invisible radioactive particles. No official warning was given. Soviet authorities, reluctant to admit the scale of the disaster, delayed evacuation for more than a day. By the time buses finally arrived 36 hours later, nearly 50,000 residents had already absorbed dangerous doses of radiation. Many believed they would return home in just a few days. Even as the crisis unfolded, Soviet officials tried to keep it quiet, but the radiation spread across international borders. On April 28th, alarms went off at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, more than 600 miles away, detecting unusually high radiation levels. At first, workers thought their own facility was leaking, but when nothing was found, suspicion turned east. Only then did the Soviet Union reluctantly admit that an accident had occurred. The explosion released vast amounts of radioactive iodine, cesium, and strontium, contaminants that would poison the land for decades. Scientists estimate that Chernobyl discharged nearly 400 times more radioactive material into the environment than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A massive exclusion zone was declared, covering more than 1,000 square miles. Dozens of villages were abandoned overnight. Crops and livestock were destroyed. Families were uprooted forever. But the initial explosion was only the beginning. Beneath the ruined reactor, water had pooled under the molten core. If it had burned through and triggered a massive steam explosion, it could have released even more radiation, contaminating much of Europe and making vast regions uninhabitable. To stop the threat of a second more massive steam explosion, 3 men volunteered for what seemed like a suicide mission. Nicknamed the Suicide Divers, they waded through radioactive water in the dark to drain the pools. Against all odds, they survived. More importantly, their bravery may have saved millions of lives. Inside the reactor's ruins, molten uranium fuel mixed with sand and steel, forming a solid radioactive mass that became known as the Elephant's Foot. In 1986, standing near it for just 5 minutes meant certain death. Even today, it remains dangerously radioactive, a toxic monument to the disaster. Radiation also devastated the natural world. The pine trees surrounding the plant absorbed such a massive dose of radiation that they turned a bright crimson color, creating what is now called the Red Forest. Decades later, the area remains one of the most contaminated places on Earth. Over 600,000 men and women, known as liquidators, were drafted to contain the disaster. They shoveled radioactive debris, sprayed chemicals, and built a massive concrete sarcophagus to encase reactor number 4. Many worked with little more than lead aprons or makeshift protective suits. Thousands later suffered from cancers and illnesses linked to radiation exposure. Ironically, the absence of humans has turned the exclusion zone into an accidental wildlife refuge. Wolves, bears, bison, and wild horses roam freely where people once lived, and their populations have surged in recent decades. In many areas, animal numbers are as high, or even higher, than in nearby protected nature reserves. Scientists still debate the long-term health effects of living in such a contaminated environment. Some studies have documented higher rates of cataracts, tumors, and genetic mutations in certain species, while others argue that radiation's impact is outweighed by the benefits of a human-free ecosystem. For now, Chernobyl stands as one of the world's strangest wildlife reserves, an odd reminder that nature can adapt, even in the shadow of catastrophe. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl drifted across Europe. In Sweden and Finland, radiation spiked so high that entire herds of reindeer were eliminated. In Scotland and Wales, farmers had to destroy thousands of sheep. Even in Greece and Italy, radiation traces were found in food. Across the Soviet Union, thousands of children later developed thyroid cancer linked to radioactive iodine exposure. The reactor is still dangerous. In 2016, a giant steel dome was installed to contain it for the next 100 years. But the fuel inside will remain hazardous for tens of thousands of years. Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. It was a turning point. It exposed the dangers of secrecy and authoritarian control, accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union, and permanently changed how the world views nuclear power. Pripyat stands today as a ghost city, empty apartments, a silent Ferris wheel, and classrooms frozen in time. It is a haunting monument to human error, but also to human sacrifice. The firefighters, liquidators, and volunteers who gave their lives to save countless others. It remains one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, a disaster whose lessons must be remembered.